Jack U's snare is probably their most instantly recognizable sound. In this tutorial, we're going to create something like this, which we'll use for the verse in our track. It's a mixture of snare, clap, and has a tonal woodblock component. We'll piece together the snare and clap with samples and create the woodblock using FM synthesis with Ableton's operator. Okay, so let's get started. Here we have a trap snare, just your normal, everyday trap snare. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to layer an acoustic sounding hand clap with that. Let's just go to our drums and listen to some claps. I'm going to use the acoustified ones. I could really use any of these. I'm just looking for one that has a longish tail on it and is relatively bright sounding. There, that one sounds pretty good. So you can see it's got a nice long tail on it. I'm just going to draw in a note. And I'm just going to pull the note back a little bit so the clap doesn't interfere with the attack of the snare. So it sounds a bit loud. I'm just going to pull the level of the clap down a little bit, just so it blends in a little bit better and we're leading with the snare. We're now going to use FM synthesis for the tonal part of the snare sound. We know Skrillex loves his FM synthesis, so why not? I have some MIDI down here we're going to use to play the sound. It's an F#4 and an A4. We'll be circling back to that in a few minutes. Let's go to our operator and components. These are nice pre-made starting points for basic sounds. I'm just going to use the default for the time being. So that's just a sine wave playing, and I've got two notes playing pretty close together. That's going to create that kind of bloop kind of effect. Now let's go back to those components and have a look at those for a second. There's a whole bunch of different preset shapes that we can just pick from here if we wanted to. Let's try the sine pluck. You know, we could really just use that, but I use Square Wave 3. That just happens to be what I used when I made the sound originally, so we're just going to run with that. The first thing I want to do is use a filter, because what we want to do is we want to create that plucky, percussive kind of sound. For that, we need to use a filter that's controlled by an envelope. I know when I made the sound the first time that I had the filter set a bit lower, so I'm just going to pull it down ever so slightly. It would still work either way, so don't worry. And let's add in some envelopes. We're going to apply this envelope to this filter. So now that is nice and short. We get a nice bright bit at the beginning, but then it quickly shortens and becomes dark. So the next thing I want to do is to bring in some resonance. Let's crank the resonance up. Okay, it gets a bit nasty when I do that. If I use the OSR filter instead, it has a much nicer response. Right? So I can even push it a little bit more. So now for the FM part. I want to modulate oscillator 1 by the frequency of oscillator 2. So I'm just going to crank this up. So right now you can see that the frequency of oscillator 2 is lower. So I'm just going to make them both the same. So now let's listen. So you can see that it matters what the frequency of this oscillator is if you're modulating that. Make sense? So let's change the oscillator to something a little less clean, because right now we're using a square wave. I want to use something that's more harmonic and not quite as nice, or not quite as linear, if you will. So I want to use noise looped. And you can see when that modulates oscillator 1, it creates a rougher, snare-like 8-bit kind of sound. So I'm just going to dial this back so it's not as in your face. And there we go. There's essentially the starting point for our snare sound. Now, one last thing that I want to do is to create some spread. Spread is just going to create a chorusing effect by detuning the oscillators. Crank it. Well, that's our basic sound. In our next video, we're going to develop this sound a lot further with a whole bunch of additional processing. Stay tuned.